You stand on the shore of the ocean watching the tide come in. You sense the call of the sea beckoning to take you in further. You step forward little by little, not knowing what to expect, but expecting more. You keep going as the ocean calls you to enter in to deeper waters.
Hello everyone, I'm Nick Peters. This is the Deeper Waters podcast, seeking to bring you the very best in Christian apologetics. Today, we're talking about Hitler. Yep, Adolf Hitler. And, well, I hope you're not experiencing technical difficulties like we just did, but was Hitler a Christian? That's a question that we usually get asked a lot, and so today we're going to be looking at, and my guest for that will be J.P. Holding of Tectonics. So, J.P., are you there?
I'm here. How you doing?
Fine. Are you hearing any sort of echo effect? I'm getting one right now.
I'm hearing very little of that. Nothing that I wouldn't have expected normally.
Okay, then. I don't know what's going on, but okay. So, now, my audience might not know who you are, so can you tell them a little about who you are and why they should be paying attention to what you have to say today?
All right, well, I'm the president of Tecton Apologetics Ministries. That's TEKTONICS.org. It's a website that's on the air in some form since about 1996, and it's been the full-time ministry I've been doing since about 2001. Over the years, it's grown gradually from something done in a spare bedroom to something done in a spare bedroom with some extra fame attached, you might say. I've had some work appear in some national magazines like the Christian Research Journal. Been referenced very nicely in some academic books, which has been nothing but a surprise to me over the years. And the website has over 1,500 articles by now, and we also have a YouTube channel with about 375 videos, several self-published educational books, and we also have a lot of good guest writers, including a guy named Nick Peters, who you may have heard of.
Yeah, I've heard he's a real loser, though.
Yeah, that's what his wife tells me, too. I don't know.
Oh, God. Yeah.
That's not true, of course.
Yeah, in fact, you were one of the people who was, in fact, at our wedding.
Yes, I was. Yes, I was indeed. And we were very happy to be there. Very proud of you.
Thank you. And things are going very well with us today. Now, let's get into this book. The book is called Hitler's Christianity. Asking the question, was Hitler a Christian? And so at the start, what I'm wondering is, why does this question even matter to us? I mean, we know that if Jesus Christ died and rose again 2,000 years or so ago, or nearly 2,000 years ago, then Christianity is true. So really, what difference does it make if Hitler was a Christian or not? Why are we even bothering?
The real question is indeed, why do people even bring it up? And oftentimes when people do bring it up, when skeptics bring it up or others bring it up, it's not really clear why they do so. But the best guess I can make is that they're hoping to somehow make a guilt by association argument, saying that Hitler was somehow inspired by Christianity to perform what evil he did perform. And so it's brought up for the same reason someone might bring up the Inquisition or the Crusades.
Right.
Simply, this is a part of the record of Christianity doing bad things.
Now, of course, you and I have both done some reading on the Crusades and Inquisition, and we can all admit there were some things done that should never have really happened. And so part of our history is going to mean that, mistakes have been made in the past. And if Hitler really was a Christian, that doesn't really say anything about Christianity, but if he wasn't, can we get anything out of that?
Yeah, that's exactly the point. And if he wasn't, well, the only thing we get out of it, we certainly get out of it defeating a very popular argument that's out there that tends to affect people emotionally. And most people have emotional connections with what happened under Hitler, with the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And it affects people thinking, this is horrible. But if you deny that Hitler is a Christian, then they lose that emotional impact.
So how did this all start? Because your main area is really New Testament material and such, and while you've gone the Crusades and Inquisition and other facets like that, Hitler seemed a bit out of a normal scope. How did this all come about?
Well, it came about in part because I was challenged on YouTube something on the subject, and I had done some research on this years ago just for my own curiosity, and I decided to open it up afresh again so I could do the videos. And when I discovered some of the scholarship on the subject, I found it so fascinating and so interesting that I decided I wanted to go ahead and make a full ebook out of it. And that's why Hitler's Christianity exists today.
What is so fascinating about this topic, then?
I would say, among other things, that so many people have it wrong, and there's so much popular misinformation out there about this. And some of the things which I'm sure we'll talk about is the idea that not only that Hitler was a Christian, but also that Hitler was into the occult. Of course, I always try to use the best scholarship I can find when doing my research, and I had never actually seen any scholarship on this subject before. And so when I picked up a couple of books on the subject and started reading them, it just seemed very interesting, and it was material that was so obscure that very few people were paying attention to it. I certainly didn't see very many skeptics who had looked into this subject in any depth. Most of them were dealing with Wikipedia was their main source.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a completely new area for you to get into some sort of study where there's very popular misunderstandings on a topic out there that people like to talk about. That must have been a totally new experience. Oh
yeah, I've only done that about 700,000 times in the past 13 years. But I've always had a fascination for the World War II era, well, history in general, but also World War II. It's been a topic of interest to me, and it just became more interesting as it went along, and the more books I found, the more interesting it got.
Okay, well, you mentioned some different beliefs that are out there about Hitler, but let's start with one that you didn't mention, and other than the claim that Hitler was a Christian, the other claim is Hitler was an atheist, and his actions just show what atheism leads to. So, does atheism own Hitler then?
No, I found no evidence for that at all. There's the idea that he was simply hiding that he was an atheist, and that he was, although he claimed to believe in God, that the idea is that his actions prove that he was an atheist. But it's too simple an argument to just say, well, he was lying about it. You have to prove something like that, and his behavior and professions on that subject make it pretty clear he did believe in some kind of God. And there's no reason to deny that he did. I mean, to me, that is too much of an easy way out of the issue. There's no need to resort to that.
And I think it's worth pointing out that we could have very easily said, yeah, Hitler was an atheist, and passed the buck on to the atheist community and said, hey, here, let's have you do this, but we really do have to go where the evidence leads, and if the evidence shows that there's no real reason to think he was an atheist, where we have to go with that.
Right. I mean, just let's not go for the simple solution. Absolutely not.
Okay.
Absolutely not.
But then we also have some people who say that where Hitler drew heavily on Darwinian evolution for his idea of a Holocaust, making a perfect race and such, wouldn't that fit into an atheistic mindset?
Well, of course, we know many people who profess to be Christians who nevertheless believe in evolution, so that's a little hard to accept to start with. And there's also, I didn't really get into this discussion because I didn't want to. I didn't want to bother with it as a side issue. Some would say that the type of Darwinism he was promoting was a very distorted sort of Darwinism, which may or may not be true. But if then we can say back, well, then he was promoting a very distorted version of Christianity. So that's not really a road that he wants to go down. It's clear that some ideas about some form of evolution were behind all the master race theories and whatnot. But how much Hitler actually understood any of that, or how much science he was actually into, I don't see any evidence that he was any more than a popularist, because he didn't have any real critical skills in that subject area.
But in your book, I did notice that it looks like Hitler still was a very vociferous reader. He was definitely not someone who was uneducated. He did read a lot, didn't he?
He certainly did read a lot. Well, of course, we know there's a difference between book knowledge and a difference between having critical thinking and understanding type of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
It's clear that what the experts say, the biographers of Hitler say, is that he read just to confirm things that he already believed. Mm-hmm. And so he might read a bunch of books and he'd pick out the things that he agreed with and ignore the rest of it that he didn't agree with. And then what he'd do is he had an incredible memory, apparently, and he would take long quote books, make it seem like he knew something about all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And in reality, he was surprising, and he didn't have the full-orbed understanding a true scholar would have.
Yeah. And I understand from your book, he actually was in some ways a bit gullible, that he bought into hypotheses that today we'd say are absolutely ludicrous, and heck, back then some people would have said were absolutely ludicrous. Is that right?
He bought into a few of those things. Heinrich Himmler was much worse at that. He bought into some things about Heinrich Himmler being the head of the SS. Now, he was into and he bought into some very strange ideas about cosmic ice theories and like the balance between ice and fire having some effect on the universe. Now, Hitler didn't go quite that far, but the fact that he read some of these materials on race, which were bad enough, it's you could say Himmler was 100% into this kind of lunacy. Hitler was maybe 40 to 50% into that kind of lunacy.
Well, since he brought the occult, let's bring up another area. Would it be accurate to say Hitler was a pagan?
No, that definitely would not be the case, and that is something popularized by many sources, such as the History Channel. What they do is they take some quite legitimate truths about Himmler, SS leader, who was into paganism, and there was a branch of Nazism that was into paganism. Then they assume that Hitler must have been into it somehow too, and they stretch some of the evidence about him being into the occult, say that he was deeply involved, but in reality his comments about the occult show that he didn't hold it in very high regard, and he put up with it from Himmler as part of this tension he'd like to keep up within his ranks. One of his ways of governing was to put his higher people at odds with each other so that he would have mastery over both sides. That's what that was all about. I mean, he was not interested in the occult to that extent, no. I mean,
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised. I'm sure my listeners ought to hear that the History Channel gets things wrong with regards to religion. That's gotta be shocking news.
Well, sometimes with the History Channel, the commercials are more accurate than the programs.
Yeah, if anyone else is thinking aliens right now, you're not alone. Okay, so Hitler wasn't a pagan, but I mean, there are so many people who say he was into the occult. I mean, he was looking for the spear that was used on Christ, wasn't he?
Right. Now, you're referring there to the book by Trevor Ravenscroft called The Spear of Destiny. Well, that's a story. That's a long story all by itself, let me tell you. Because Ravenscroft basically made up the entire story for that book. He didn't make up the person who he supposedly talked to, which was a gentleman named Walter Stein. Now, this Walter Stein was a real person, but he had Stein had never actually met Hitler, and Ravenscroft never actually met Stein except through a seance, supposedly. The whole book's Spear of Destiny is based on these made-up tales that Ravenscroft received through this seance. So it can't be taken seriously. Yeah, he certainly did not go after the Spear of Destiny.
And unfortunately, Ravenscroft has been picked up by a number of Christians as well as a reliable source, hasn't he?
Yes, and that's particularly unfortunate. In particular, I'm thinking Erwin Lutzer, who is otherwise a very respected pastor and writer, made some use of Ravenscroft's material in his book on Hitler.
Is there any...
Go ahead.
Is there any other evidence that people bring up to show that Hitler was into the occult?
Well, there's a number of minor things that are brought up. Let me just go through my list here of some of the things. Aside from simply making things up, one of the more popular claims is that Hitler read some occult literature when he was a young man. And to some extent, this might be true simply because he was such a voracious reader, as we mentioned earlier.
Right.
So certainly little of that was probably in his reading list. But the particular publication that's in mind here is something called Ostara. And this is a publication that was known for both a little bit of paganism and for racial theory. And chances are that Hitler was interested in the racial theory aspect far more than he was interested in the occult aspect.
I'm hearing this. Go ahead.
Okay. Another thing that's very popular on that count is the idea that he chose the swastika as the symbol of the Nazi Party, and that's supposed to be an occult symbol. And while it have certain occult ideas attached to it, he himself said it was meant to represent the struggle for the victory of Aryan, Aryan, mankind, over what is considered to be Judaism. He didn't assign any occult any sort of occult interpretation to the swastika.
And we should point out that when we use the term Aryan today, unless we mean otherwise, we mean the race that Hitler saw as superior. We don't mean the nonsense doctrine that was came up by Arius, to which I think you just had a couple of visitors supporting that doctrine just before the show came on.
A little ironic. Yeah, a little ironic. Yes, the Arian heresy is spelled with an I rather than a Y. So we should make sure we understand the difference between the two.
And when you were telling me about how he read some of those as a young man, and people are saying that means he was into the occult, when I could look around my library in here, because I do a show from my library and say, well, I must be into Mormonism, atheism, Christianity, everything else then, because I've got books on here by authors of most persuasions, and I've read them, so I must be of that persuasion.
Oh, yeah. See, a library, they say a library can tell you about someone, and that's true. It can tell you a lot about their interests, but it doesn't tell you necessarily what direction they lean in as far as in that library. Absolutely.
So, now, this doesn't mean, as you said, that none of Hitler's own troops were in the occult. Some of the leading members were, but when it comes to Hitler himself, we can firmly state that Hitler was not into the occult.
Absolutely, and the few statements we have on the subject show that he was not in favor of it at all. In fact, he sort of, concerning Himmler, he said, well, are you still believing this nonsense in spite of how far we've moved along? He criticized Himmler for being involved in the occult or in paganism. But little we have from the opposite, yes.
Okay. Well, we're coming up on our first break here, and we've already said Hitler was not an atheist. He was not pagan. And he was not into the occult. What we haven't said, though, is what he was. And I think we'll save that for when we come back from our first break. So you all hold on, and we'll be back after this break. I'm Nick Peters. This is the Deeper Waters Podcast.
Join Unituber and Army Girl for Christ as they discuss spiritual warfare, spiritual preparedness, the end times, life issues, and personal and spiritual growth. That's www.truthradionet.com, truthradionet.com.
And I'm Nick Peters. This is the Deeper Waters Podcast, bringing you the best in Christian apologetics. My guest is J.P. Holding of Tech Talks. We're talking about his newest ebook, Hitler's Christianity. Now, if you want to call in and ask a question about Hitler today, the number is 714-242-5180. I'll be giving that out later on in the show as well. Now, we've said Hitler wasn't into the occult. He wasn't a pagan. He wasn't an atheist. So, based on your research, what was he?
Well, I would have to say that Hitler was a cultist, C-U-L-T-I-S-T, to make sure we don't confuse that with occultist. He was involved in what would be termed his own sort of cult, although he didn't start it. The belief system that he was involved in has been termed positive Christianity. And positive Christianity had its origins from a time before he was born and could be traced to some extent back to 19th century Germany. So we can talk about beliefs that it held. But he came to it somewhat late as joining the Nazi Party in the 1920s. And the Nazi Party put positive Christianity in as part of its platform of what it believed in. So he was not the originator of it. He was a joiner in that case. But he
so
would
before we get...
Yes, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yes, well, I was just going to say, what we would term positive Christianity a cult. And in fact, when I told a leading cult expert about it, he said, yes, if Walter Martin had written his famous book on cults today, he would have included positive Christianity in one of the chapters.
Now, when we say cult, we kind of mean things like for Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, groups that try to call themselves Christians, but really differ from Christianity. Right.
Very much different, and different on critical points. I mean, we're not talking about differences on very simple points like what color was Jesus' hair. We're talking about things about Jesus' identity and like who he was with relation to God the Father. And we gave the example earlier of the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Arians, A-R-I-A-N. Their beliefs about Jesus are very different. They believe that Jesus was a created being rather than an eternal. So they are classified as a cult. By the same token, beliefs of positive Christianity were so vastly different that they have to be classified as a cult.
Now, we need to be clear also on what would actually make something a cult, because it has to be more than just difference in beliefs. I mean, heck, you and I disagree on some secondary doctrines. You and your wife, I understand, disagree. Me and my wife disagree on some secondary doctrines. But there's not a case that because about any one of us are part of a cult group. So what makes something a cult?
Well, it has to be, first of all, a deviation from a larger group. And now, by that definition, and this would be true, and we don't need to be ashamed of saying it, Christianity would have been considered a cult of Judaism in the first century. Obviously, the Jews of that era would have considered Christianity false, which is a second thing that has to be characteristic of a cult. Then on, it's a matter of judgment in terms of how much of a deviation you have, and again, what that concerns. It fundamentally changes beliefs of that original system that it deviates from, or that it denies what that system believed. We're pretty much dealing with a cult. There are some other characteristics to point to as well. A cult will claim, as positive Christianity often did, that they represent a reinstatement, a restoring of an original belief, whereas mainstream group, they say, is the one that is wrong.
Yeah, and this happens with the Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, both who would say the Orthodox Church is apostate, although the Mormons are trying to back away from that claim now.
Yes, of course. Early on in his history, Joseph Smith and the early Mormons, and even to this day, Mormon apologists, will blame Greek thinking for corrupting Christianity, and the Jehovah's Witnesses will do the same thing. Somehow the Greeks managed to mess up everything, it seems. But they will say that we're restoring the truth that was lost for all this time, and that's especially ironic because they're saying all this time, long ago this was known to be true, but it was lost for thousands of years. Now we've recovered the truth.
Okay, so when we're talking about positive Christianity, what is the truth according to positive Christianity?
Well, I identified three particular most important things about positive Christianity that made it far different from mainstream Christianity and warranted the designation of it as a cult. Let's run over all three of those. That's the most important thing, all of that, is what they did to the Bible. Now, the Christianity has an accepted canon, or list of books in the Old and New Testament that are accepted. There's some minor variations within the Catholic churches and other places as far as secondary canonical books and whatnot. As a whole, body that is called Christianity accepts the 67 books of the Bible as authoritative.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the positive Christians were particularly radical on this point. Essentially, they dumped the entire New Testament. And as far as the New Testament, they dumped any part of it that was, in their mind, too Jewish. And of course, there goes Matthew. There goes a lot of the Gospels. There goes James. And they dumped a lot. Some of them dumped a lot of Paul, too, although some of them wanted to keep him. They never really decided exactly what to do about him in any unified way. They didn't have that much time to do it, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But in the end, you could say they rejected at least 90% of the Bible. Pretty significant.
I've heard you say even Marcion would have said that was a bit extreme.
Yes, well, Marcion, of course, was the 2nd century heretic who rejected the entirety of the Old Testament and kept mostly from the New Testament the letters of Paul as well as the Gospel of Luke. But not even he went quite as far as these guys. It was going down to the cafeteria, of course, and just taking one spoonful of peas from the whole cafeteria and saying, here's all we want to eat.
But you said that's one way, very different. What was the second way that marked them out as a cult what they believed?
Yes, the second thing, which is particularly important, is I've termed a de-Judaized Jesus. Now, of course, since they were not particularly fond of the Jews, the Nazis had to explain how they were following Jesus, who was clearly a Jew. Their solution is essentially to say, well, he wasn't really a Jew. He was actually a Gentile of some kind, most likely a member of that Aryan master race, or maybe he was from one of the Germanic regions. And they would say as well that all the apostles were members of this race, except for Judas Iscariot. They could keep him as a Jew since he was the betrayer. But as for the rest, they would they would say that Jesus was, perhaps had maybe one drop of Semitic blood was the most they would allow. That's wow. But as a whole, they would say that he was not Jewish at all, that he was actually against the Jews in entirety.
It's pretty interesting that there's this statement made about Jesus not being Jewish, because it's my understanding that part of a third quest for historical Jesus has involved returning Jesus to his Jewish roots. So could it be positive Christianity was also affected by the liberal scholarship of its day in Christianity?
There have been some ideas about that, and I didn't discuss it in the book, but a historian named Richard Steigman Gall did say that, yes, that had some part in it. The German biblical scholarship, extremely liberal, 18th century. The name that comes to mind immediately is Rudolf Bultmann, who many of us know was interested in a program of demythologizing the New Testament relevant to people of his day. But what it amounted to was simply saying, well, all these stories are false. There's nothing historical to the New Testament. Whatever you feel about it, that's what makes you a Christian. In an environment like that, it would be very easy for positive Christianity or any particular cultic group to say, all right, well, since that's not a reliable historical document, we can read into it what we want to.
Okay. So even if it didn't directly cause it, it sure didn't really provide much of a hindrance to it either.
Yeah, I would say it performed an enabling role. That would be a good way to put it.
Okay, now what would be the third way? The third thing that they believe that would show them to be a cult?
The third one's a little vague. It's not so much a belief as it is a lack of belief. The positive Christians had a very strong aversion to and indifference to doctrine. They were far more concerned with orthopraxy, which is right practice, rather than orthodoxy, which is right belief. You'll see a lot of statements from Hitler about feeding the hungry, or you won't find statements from Hitler or other Nazis about things like the Trinity or the resurrection. Paul would say, if Christ is not risen, your faith is in vain. I think they would more likely put it, if Christ is not risen, so what? Let's get busy.
It's a shame because we see a lot of that going on today in liberal scholarship here in America, and many churches even would define a Christian by how they do with what they call social justice, for instance.
Yeah, there can be too much of an emphasis on something like that. There is something of a parallel there, but that's also a parallel that we see in many of the legalistic cults like the Jehovah's Witnesses. The feeling is, well, we have to act in some way in order to earn God's favor. And while that wasn't the concern of the positive Christians, I mean, the main purpose for positive Christians in emphasizing orthopraxy rather than orthodoxy was that they were trying to unite the churches in Germany under one banner. And the only way to do that was to ignore doctrine. So that was their main purpose in that belief system.
And part of me is hearing this and thinking, how can we say the Nazis, who poured about the Holocaust and had Joseph Mengele and others in their midst, cared about right living?
Well, of course, that was another a semantic trick on their part, because they redefined Jews and others as being outside the human race. So they could say, well, you should be good to humanity. Well, the way to get around that in their view is to say, but these guys over here aren't humanity. So that was a non-religious kind of trick.
You know, when January comes around, we're going to have some shows done on the topic of abortion, and that's a similar trick that's done here today to say that the unborn isn't human or isn't a person, therefore it's okay.
Yes, so you know, it comes from much the same direction. You know exactly how that works.
Yep. So now, since we talked about what positive Christians believe, let's go back to the origins that you were talking about. How did a belief like this even come about?
Well, as I was mentioning earlier, it started sometime in the 19th century, and there were a couple of different people who were considered something like founders, although they weren't. I don't think they were actually believing that they were starting their own movement. There's a sort of a reaction to the Catholic Church called Ultramontanism. There's a reaction to this idea that Catholic churches, control over theology and life. And also it's sort of a German national kind of something that took a certain pride in Germany, tried to blend German thought with. You can see how that might lead to something like positive Christianity, which turns Jesus into someone who is a member of the master race. It's like trying to make Christianity into a German product. And so you don't see the actual gelling of this together until just before the time when Hitler joined the Nazi Party and just after World War I, when you see a major writer who's named Franz Schrungheimer Heimdall, who in 1918 put together a book called The Coming Reich, in which you could have called that book a sort of manifesto for positive Christianity. In fact, his ideas were so similar to what the positive Christians came up with that he later tried to claim credit for inspiring them, although that's not entirely true. But he did his best to try and mix together Germanic ideas with the Bible and with Christianity in order to make something that particularly German religion, or particularly German version of Christianity.
Now, in fact, positive Christianity also, like many cults today, even had its own apologists, didn't it?
It did indeed have its own apologist, and it was a very small group with a very long name. I'll just refer to them as the Institute, since it's like a 10-word name that they went by. And they had their own group of scholars who were designated to produce papers and whatnot in support of positive Christian theology. Now, their relationship with the Nazi leadership was sort of tenuous. The Nazis sort of did not want to support this group, but they sort of did want to support it. So it was kind of a rocky relationship they had with this group. But there were a number of scholars, again, who were involved in this, and one of them, unfortunately, who is associated with the movement is one whose work we use quite frequently even today. That is Art Kittle, who is the author of the Theological Word Book of the New Testament. And he was never quite the fanatic that some of these people were, but he did or somewhat touch on some of these ideas supporting positive Christianity. And after a certain point in 1933, he became particularly strong attacking Judaism. Although he was never quite as bad as these others, he does suffer from that stain of being involved with it.
Yeah, it wouldn't be accurate if I were to say he was a Nazi, would it?
He would never went quite that far. No, he was never, making the speeches in favor of Nazism. He wasn't wearing the swastika all over the place. And it's a little difficult to tell exactly what his motives were at this late date. And he never quite went so far, for example, as to say that Jesus wasn't a Jew. Although he did suggest Jesus might have had some non-Jewish blood in his.
Okay. And so I'm having some connection problems on my end, so sometimes I'm going in and out. I'm being told that it's nothing with your end, it's all on my end here. So the next thing I'm thinking along these lines, though, is all this talk we've heard about making sure Jesus wasn't Jewish, removing the Jewish portions of the New Testament, getting rid of the Old Testament that's Jewish. What was the big problem with Jews?
As far as the Nazis were concerned?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's more of a matter of history I didn't get into much. We can sum that up a bit. I mean, there was a general inclination ranging back, some would say, to the early church, which there was a religious opposition to Judaism and Christianity. This is an important distinction to be made, because, again, I didn't get much into that. Much of what was anti-Semitism days of, like, 2nd century on through 18th and 19th century was based on purely religious ground, based on the idea that these people did not recognize Jesus as Messiah. They're continuing to adhere to a false belief system. Now, a key difference with the Nazi Party, their opposition to Judaism was based on racial ground. Of course, part of that, they would freely make use of some of the anti-religious arguments. But their idea was more that Jews were an inferior race of people who had poisoned people, so to speak. And had, in turn, affected the politics of the day and caused numerous social problems. Of course, someone like Karl Marx was designated as a Jew, and communism was one of the great enemies of Nazis, too. And Marx, as a Jew, was part of that problem. And other members of Jewish society were blamed for various things as well. Everyone, even if you weren't a major figure like Marx, you were held responsible for something bad.
If communism was part of the problem, but why would Hitler have aligned himself with someone like Stalin? But was it just the enemy of my enemy is my friend, or what?
At that point, it seemed to have been, and although I didn't study that particular aspect too closely, it was more of a pragmatic move to align himself, that he could devote his time and resources to attacking on the Western side. Of course, Hitler did change his mind about that, as we know, and that probably aided his downfall.
Yeah, as soon as he thought he no longer needed Russia, well, go ahead and do away with that enemy.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, we've had a lot of talk about what positive Christianity is. We're going to get into that a little bit more after this break. I'm Nick Peters, the Deeper Waters Podcast. My guest is J.P. Holding of Tectonics, talking about his book, Hitler's Christianity. We'll be back after this break.
It's here, the official Rock Radio mobile app. Listen to your favorite rock radio programs on your iPhone, iPad, iPod, Kindle Fire, Android smartphones, and tablets. The best thing is, it's absolutely free. Download it now from the iTunes or Google Play App Store, or get a link at our website, CYIWorldwide.com. Rock Radio, Christian radio that doesn't suck.
I'm Nick Peters. This is the Deeper Waters Podcast. My guest is J.P. Holding of Tectonics Ministries. We're talking about his book, Hitler's Christianity. If you want to join in on the conversation, the number is 714-242-5180. Now, we've talked about positive Christianity, and it gained such a stronghold in Germany. So it's really important for us to realize, what was Germany really like in the time of Hitler? I mean, it's difficult to diagnose a whole people group, but let's try and figure out the best we can of the spiritual climate of Germany. What can you tell us about that?
Well, there was a difficult place to live for a spiritual person because, first of all, as we mentioned, so much of biblical scholarship from Germany was towards the liberal end, and it managed to demythologize, in many people's eyes, what Christianity stood for. And one particular commentator, J.S. Conway, remarked that basically Hitler was one of the many people who were like looking for something to believe in at this time, because the basis for Christianity had been torn down, and there was nothing more, to take its place. I mean, you had the church in its place as a, still serving people, but just how much of this was genuine faith is seriously open to question, I think. And at the very least, though, you could argue that there was so much in Germany that had affected Christianity and had robbed it of its power, that what people believed in was something entirely different than what we know of today from the Bible.
Mm-hmm. Could it be seen kind of like a folk religion at the time, or?
Yes, that is one way to put it. And I mentioned briefly earlier about German nationalism. This reworking and rolling in of German nationalism and of national pride into Christianity turned it into something that could be called a folk religion of the time.
So where did this idea come from, though, that the German race was the superior race?
Well, there was this whole idea of national pride in every country in Europe at the time. So it wasn't something that was uniquely German. But perhaps you could say perhaps it came from Martin Luther to some extent. You could say that it came from their political history. You could say it came from the fact that they thought of themselves as the defenders of the faith against the heathen, and that was a critical thing in World War I, especially. They viewed themselves as having been appointed by God to punish other nations, and of course, when you have that idea and you lose, you end up wondering, well, what happened there?
As I was reading through this part of the book, I really got concerned because I saw so many parallels to the church and culture in America today.
Yes, I did see some of that. Now, we don't have the nationalism, but I think what we do have is more like a cult of the individual. That was I did see some parallels, yes.
Well, I would say we, in many cases, do have some very strong nationalism going on. I say that as someone who's very conservative, who does love our country, but we can often have a attitude that we're immune to failure, that nothing can happen to us, that we have our own manifest destiny as well.
Yeah, I can see that kind of thing as part of it too. I can see that parallel in the American church as well.
Yeah. And then the other parallel that I can see along those lines is this idea that we often see our culture as the superior one, and as you and I both know, that culture is often read back into the Bible, telling us things then that it never was meant to tell us.
Yeah, and to that extent, they tried to turn Christianity into a religion for Germans, and we have frequently turned Christianity into a religion for modern Americans. And, we only need to turn on Joyce Meyer or Joel Osteen, and that's not a suggestion, that's a warning.
Yeah. Good.
Definitely don't want to do that. And you will see, much the same thing. And I don't want to make the comparison too strong because obviously, this version of Christianity in America is not encouraging anyone to kill people. But there is a harm you do when you mix things. You mix your own cultural positions and your own cultural preferences with the original faith. You have to be careful what you do with that.
One of the things that we could say it could be doing, though, is enabling us to have a situation such as this. There was reports about an area in New York called the Burned Over District, where there were some major revivals held in the 1800s, and you had mass conversions take place, but there wasn't a foundation given to these people who had just converted. And from that one district came both the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses eventually.
Yep. It does produce. It can produce a cultic mentality. I mean, and I've used Osteen and Meyer as an example, but there are far worse examples that we could come up with.
Yeah, so the idea that I was getting out of it is that part of the importance of doing what we do in the area of Christian apologetics is to keep those strong foundations up and running, because, I mean, heck, buying into Joel Osteen and Joyce Meyer, yeah, that's terrible. It's a shame whenever it happens, but we could be just as prone as the Germans were to a similar false doctrine. It'd be even worse to be buying into Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, or in this case, positive Christianity.
Right. If you don't have a foundation, it's very easy to buy into. You have to have the facts straight, so that you aren't led away by falsehoods.
So let's move on to Hitler's own group himself. We've said Hitler wasn't an occultist, he wasn't a pagan, he wasn't an atheist, and he definitely wasn't an Orthodox Christian. He practiced positive Christianity. How about his staff? What do we know about them? Was there anyone of there who we could call an Orthodox Christian?
I could not find a single one of them who would be classified as an Orthodox Christian, and I investigated a wide range of them. Now, it's a little difficult to investigate many of these people because many of them didn't leave much behind for us. Also, like, who do you define as a major figure party? Very few of them have. There's so many of them, but very few actually have biographies written about them. So I selected a broad range of people to look into, and then selected those about whom there was any significant source material that I could use to investigate what their beliefs were. And the results basically are we have a few pagans, have a few positive Christians, we have a few people who just went out on their own with their own ideas. Let's just run over a few of them, of course.
Okay.
On the side of the positive Christians, you definitely have Joseph Goebbels, who was Hitler's propaganda minister. Now, he was raised as a Catholic, but he slowly went away from that as a teenager, and this is, of course, a very familiar story even today for people who deconvert. That's the time when everyone seems they know better, and it's time to leave their original faith. And by the time he discovered the Nazi Party, you see him making statements about Hitler that, like, who is this guy? He's half plebeian and half God. He's comparing Hitler essentially to a divine leader, much like someone hiring Jim Jones or some other cult leader. And we see, over time, as he became more invested in the Nazi Party, it became clear that he had aligned himself with positive Christianity. Now, another one member of the positive Christian, Hermann Goering, who was Hitler's chief economic planner and the head of the Air Force. He was a little more difficult to get into because he was one of these kind of people who never wrote anything down. And he didn't like to write, he didn't like to read, he preferred not to leave us any information on anything. Just lazy on him. But what little we have on him indicates that he left the Christian faith of his youth and went for positive Christianity instead as an adult. Then we have Himmler, of course, of the SS, and I've already mentioned about him. He was into paganism and the occult. So that accounts for the top three in Hitler's party, and after that we get into some of the smaller names.
Now, didn't you say about... I'm sorry, it's breaking out for me. Didn't you say about Himmler that he was probably the most wicked of Hitler's associates?
Yeah, he's often rated as even more wicked than Hitler because he was because he was the head of the SS, which is like the chief enforcer for some of the worst policies and actions of the Nazi Party. And he was quite open about putting pagan symbols on the SS uniforms. We've seen the SS runes, which are their symbol, and also the Death's Head ring, and of course, black was one of their colors. So he was not, it was like starting your own motorcycle gang. He wasn't afraid to make them look wicked.
Mm-hmm.
And Himmler, like Goebbels, started as a Catholic, evolved into this stuff, which included the occult, and that's where he ended up.
Mm-hmm. So we could even look and say, had some of these guys been provided with a better foundation? I mean, you can't say it definitively, but it could be that the Holocaust might have never even happened then.
Now that's true. I mean, I look for any indication. Himmler in particular was a big reader, and he did study some apologetics works, believe it or not. But he was also reading some real weird stuff, such as what I mentioned earlier, like the cosmic ice theory stuff. And he ended up believing a lot of that and believing in some conspiracy theory stuff too. So, while he did his studies, he clearly wasn't critical of his studies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, years ago, I remember reading Harold O.J. Brown's book, The Sensate Culture, and how he talked about Nazi Germany was an example of a sensate culture that people pretty much just went by wherever their passion was tearing them and just sought the satisfaction of their own desires entirely. And when a culture gets that way, they don't really think about the great ideals anymore. They, in fact, lose their ability to think.
Oh, absolutely. The feeling becomes the basis, or when experience becomes the basis, a result is never positive.
Mm-hmm. And what about someone like some of the minor figures, like, well, they weren't minor, but they weren't as high up in Hitler's staff, people like Mengele, for instance?
Right, the lower-ranking figures. Well, Joseph Mengele is one of those people we don't have a whole lot of information on, again, because he didn't write a lot for us. He was another one who grew up as a Catholic. As a college student, he became interested in a fellow who became another major figure among the Nazis, Alfred Rosenberg. And Rosenberg was in line with Himmler as one of the pagan or occult type of Nazi party. And we again don't have a whole lot from Mengele, but his statements later on indicated that he disliked the Bible, thought that it adversely affected Germany. He was definitely on camp, virtually. Another fellow, of course, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay, well, let's pick another guy. Adolf Eichmann is known as one of the leading architects of the Holocaust, and he's of interest because he was about the only one, the major name, who was captured and executed. So we have a little better insight into him. He apparently started in some sort of Protestant belief system, but by the time he was captured, he says, he admitted to be saying, I'm a pantheist, essentially. I don't believe... I won't read the Old Testament. I don't care for the Bible. I don't believe in hell. Ended up a mix of Greek philosophy, Buddhism, Nietzsche, and a mix of all things together. That would be Eichmann. But pick one other one to talk about here. Now, Albert Speer. Okay, if someone might ask, were there any atheists in that bunch? Martin Bormann might have been one. Albert Speer might have come closest. The best you can say of Speer that he was pretty much indifferent to religion. He didn't have an interest in it really at all. Although he didn't have quite an anti-Christian attitude, he also wasn't in favor of it either. He's of interest because he was the major Nazi who went to jail and was released after a time and then lived freely for a while. And he's also referred to as the only one that was really repentant to any extent.
In your book, you even say that he came to find Judaism as a superior religion and sought guidance through prayer.
Yeah, he looked for some relief because he had this huge burden of guilt for all he had done. And he did some study, and he was asked, "Do you believe in God?" He said, "I don't think so." He nevertheless considered Judaism to have moral value. I understood as that he even profits from his books, he made some contributions to charities or some kind.
So, but in the end, we look through Orthodox Christianity really played no role, if any, in Hitler's staff and higher-up organizations, did it?
I could not find one bit of evidence that that was the case.
Of course, it could be some Nazis did consider themselves Orthodox Christians, but we can't say that about the staff.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, and of course the positive Christians and people like, certainly people like Himmler would have said they are not Christians. People like Goebbels and Goering, who were involved in positive Christianity, would have said, along with the movement, we are restoring the original Christianity, and so they would have essentially considered Christianity to be cult while they were restoring the truth. And so you can pretty clearly say that they saw themselves as dividing off Orthodox Christianity. And that's one of the strongest arguments for saying that Hitler was not truly a Christian, because the belief system itself declared that it was not an Orthodox.
So these would have been like the Mormons at the start. They would have said, we're not Christians because Christianity is corrupt, and who wants to be a part of something corrupt? We are the ones that are restoring the faith. We could say we're Christians in the sense that we're truly the followers of Christ, but we're not Christians in the sense that we believe the same things that Orthodox Christians believe.
Exactly. They clearly differentiated themselves from Orthodox Christianity, and that is a hallmark of a cult. And
to be further accurate, they would in fact say they truly are the Orthodox Christianity. We're the ones that aren't Orthodox.
Precisely. You and I would be regarded as heretics.
Now let's get started into something else here a little bit brief. What could have really been done with someone like Hitler in power? Because, Romans 13 tells us that we need to obey the rulers who are in power, doesn't it?
And that's precisely one of the theological issues that faced Germans in that time, because Romans 13 had a particularly strong history within Lutheranism. It was taken to believe that you should simply obey the person in power, or obliged to it. For a bit of context, we have to remember something. Paul wrote that letter. Christianity it was about the mid-50s A.D. Christianity was being pretty much left alone. There's no demand leaders that they compromise their beliefs, and Nero, not a serious threat at the time. I would say that if Paul had written 10 years later, that advice would have been somewhat not qualified. So, see the qualification already in Acts where told have to obey God rather than men.
Yeah, I was about to point to that one too.
Exactly. So Paul was able to speak as he was in Romans 13 because people were not being told to disobey God at the time. Christians were not being told to do that. But for some reason, many Germans did not come up with that resolution, and so you have a quote, one from a Catholic cardinal at the time in 36, which says, "As supreme head of the German Reich, you are for us the authority willed by God, to whom we owe reverence and obedience." And so their job, as they saw it, was simply to obey and not to question. And yet at the same time, they would also recognize that there was evil being done. And so, as one commentator put it, that you could put the view of German Catholics in this time as, we fulfill our Christian and patriotic duty, but beyond this, deliver us from the Nazi regime. So at the same time that they were obeying this regime, they were hoping that it would fall.
Okay. Well, we're going to be discussing this kind of thing a little bit more here after our next break here. I'm Nick Peters of the Deeper Waters Podcast. We'll be back after this break to continue talking with my guest, J.P. Holding of Tectonics Ministries.
Check out CYIWorldwide.com. CYIWorldwide.com. Home of Grok Radio. Free music downloads, advice, prayer, and support. CYIWorldwide.com. Do you grok?
Are you tired of the same old corporate Christian music on the radio? Check out Music Surge on Grok Radio. playing Christian music that doesn't suck. Download episodes now at CYIWorldwide.com.
And welcome back. I'm Nick Peters of the Deeper Waters Podcast. My guest today is J.P. Holding of Tectonics Ministries. I really hope you're enjoying this week's show, but I definitely hope you'll come back next week. We've got a real treat in store for you. My guest next week will be Dr. Paul Meier, and our whole show will be about ancient historiography, how it's to be done, what rules are to be followed, and in the last part, we'll tie this all into the study of Jesus. So it's going to be a really good show, and I know that my guest today really admires the work of Paul Meier, and if you're some of those who are flummoxed by dealing with the YouTube atheist and others out there, Paul Meier will give us a good rundown on how to do history. So, yeah, it's going to be a fun one.
A lot of people out there need a history lesson, don't they?
Yep. Okay, so now we're getting back to Hitler then, and Romans 13. So one could have said the Germans could have stood up to Hitler and still have been living within biblical practice, because we have a present for that in Acts, right?
Yeah, oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely we have that. And we also have clear precedent that Jesus himself stood up to the powers of his time. Of course, the high priesthood essentially represented the executive power on behalf of the Romans, and so clearly, he, when it came to Jesus and Caiaphas, he was not making himself subject to the power of Caiaphas.
And in fact, Bonhoeffer was one such person who was even involved in an assassination plot on Hitler.
That's right. Yeah, Dietrich Bonhoeffer is the most famous name among the resistance movement from the church, and he himself very much struggled over this. Like, should he participate in an assassination attempt against Hitler or not? And Romans 13 was one of the things that made him wonder whether he ought to do that. And in order to participate in that assassination, he found he essentially had to distance himself from the church. So that is how he resolved it. He decided, well, I think it needs to be done, so I'm going to have to, distance myself from the church's system so that I can be involved in it.
Well, let's bring up another challenge that's raised, and this was an interesting one that was raised up by your good friend, the Arizona atheist, that Christianity is ultimately responsible for the Holocaust because it's responsible for positive Christianity, and positive Christianity brought about this, so the problem is still on our heads.
Well, if you define responsible for in as broad a way as possible and without really tracing any history, yeah, you could say that. I mean, what do you mean by responsible for? If you're responsible for deviations, then the critic like Arizona Atheist who says this has to come up with some way that he can make Christianity responsible for positive Christianity, but also not make atheism responsible for what was done by, say, Joseph Stalin. And so, how do you do that? And you have to come up with some way to make a division. And the only way you can do that is by not carefully defining your terms, by not carefully defining what Christianity is, by being indifferent to what Christianity is, and by saying, well, essentially a Christian is anything that I say it is. Anyone who says he is a Christian, that person is a Christian. The loosest criteria you can come up with is what you have to do.
But some people could say that, aren't you just doing special pleading to say that Hitler wasn't a Christian?
The thing I would do to say to such people then is, well, let me have you tell me what a Christian is. Now, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to make them do that to start because I've already done the study on the first century belief system and on history of the church and what those backgrounds are. This is what you mentioned, Arizona 8. This is exactly what I did with him. I would point to things, for example, like the doctrine of the Trinity. I would say, well, there's a huge difference, obviously, in terms of what they believed about this, what a cult believes about this, and what Christianity believes this. The only way you can get around that is by doing as he did, which is to dismiss that as a side issue and refuse to discuss it. These are not side issues. These are at the heart of how you define. So only by ignoring things like that, you just say, well, you're doing special pleading. Well, I've made my case for why it isn't special, knowing that Hitler's beliefs do not reflect Christianity as it is defined. That's the only. It's a charge that's easy to throw out, but it's not something that proving.
And ironically, your own argument has shown that if we followed his principle to its logical conclusion, it's not Christianity that's responsible for the Holocaust, it'd be Judaism that's responsible for the Holocaust.
Because if you're going to say that even though positive Christianity is a cult of Christianity, it's still considered Christianity, then Judaism considers Christianity a cult of Judaism. And so if you can't divide off positive Christianity from Christianity, then you also can't divide off Christianity from Judaism, especially since you have writers like Paul professing to still be Jews. They clearly did not believe themselves to be deviant from their true Jewish faith. So if they're going to argue that Hitler was not a deviant from true Christian faith, then they can't argue that Paul was a deviant from Jewish faith. It's either one or the other.
We should point out that cults are very rarely monolithic. You have splinter groups from the Mormons, from the Jehovah's Witnesses, from other religions like Islam itself. That there's rarely just one group. They go off in several different directions a lot of times.
Precisely. Are you going to define each of these as Christian too? Is what I'd like to know. And one of the things that was amusing about my interactions with atheists was that I was asking them, how far do you have to go before you'll say someone is not a Christian? I pressed him on this a couple of times, for example, with the Canaan. Like, how much of the Canaan can reject and still be a Christian by your account? Basically, his answer was, there was no limit. So how does that work out?
If there was no limit, then couldn't we just as well say, atheists are Christians, and therefore atheism is responsible for the Holocaust?
That's it, too, because there is a group that calls itself the Christian Atheist. And he thought they were silly for doing that, but you can't just dismiss them. They don't think it's silly. They think it's serious.
Now, he does bring up points about race, and this is something we should get into about racism being in the Bible, such as we might talk about, the extinguishing of the Amalekites, or cutting down the tallest members of the Moabites, and such. Is this racism in the Bible?
Well, let's discuss that last one in particular, because that's particularly an amusing example. His idea, there was a portion in the Bible where David had apparently made a bunch of the Moabites, line up or lay down, and he would lay them down against some kind of like measuring device. And if it's like a sort of a black version of that thing at the fair, where if you have to be at least 5 feet tall to ride the ride. He did it where if you were taller than this string or whatever, you got killed. And the argument this atheist made, and he got it apparently from Hector Avalos, is that David was definitely a reliable source. He got this idea that David was engaged in a eugenic practice, that he was somehow trying to modify the racial stock of the Moabites so that there would no longer be tall people among the Moabites. Now, there's a couple of ironies in this, and one of them is that Avalos got this notion via another scholar named Susan Niditch, who simply mentioned this idea, but she ended up rejecting it. And what Niditch said was, some have explained this passage by suggesting that David kills the tallest and ablest men, allowing the runts to live, as if David were employing genetic selection to weaken Moabite stock. In fact, David is pictured to be coldly more arbitrary, claiming for himself the godly power of life and death. In other words, what David was doing, according to Niditch, saying, well, I'm going to set this random spot or height taller than it, get killed. There was a certain level of fear involved in that for the Moabites. Now, in my opinion, the most David could have been doing, he may have been trying to kill taller warriors because they were more effective in battle. Because battle was hand to hand, more reach meant you were more effective. But eugenics means that you're trying to alter the future of people in question. In other words, you're trying to make it so that all people never come out again. Now, there's no way that David was engaged in this because, first of all, as we know, eugenics wasn't known until about the 1800s to any real extent. So this hypothesis coming up with was, David had special knowledge of eugenics 2,000, 3,000 years before anyone else, and no one else thought of it again. And the second thing is, David made no effort to kill off children of these warriors. He didn't try and kill off any of the tall Moabite women. So obviously, he was not engaged in eugenics. This is the sort of desperate idea people have to come up with, I think, in order to say that that Hitler was coming up with some of his ideas from the Bible legitimately.
It seems amazing to hear that the same groups that often talk about how ignorant people were back in biblical times are at the same time willing to say, and they knew about eugenics back then.
Oh, yeah, we've seen that more than a few times, too. I mean, we've seen that with the whole, I think you're familiar with the old bat and bird thing.
Yes.
I think, to me, that someone helped with a video, someone helped me with a video on that subject.
Yeah. We're familiar with the number of legs that are on insects. Maybe we should just briefly explain what that is for the audience.
Okay, well, let me do I'll do the bat bird one. I like, because that one's a favorite of mine. In Leviticus and Deuteronomy, many have noted that the English Bible says this the bat among as birds. And the argument I reply to on that is, well, this is not, the ancient word that we translate bird does not mean a something with feathers that is warm-blooded. It simply means a flying creature. And what these critics will reply to on that will say, well, obviously, they must have had in mind the modern definition of a bird when they wrote that. So in other words, Hebrews of the ancient times had this definition of a bird as it included bats, and they thought that bats had feathers and had all the scientific characteristics we now associate with a bird. But then that meaning was lost for thousands of years and recovered much later.
Yeah.
So that is a good example of how the critic like this will say that, they had special scientific knowledge back then, and that's what makes it wrong.
And to explain the part with insects, there's a part in Leviticus also where it says that insects with 4 legs may be eaten. And it says, well, don't they know that insects had 6 legs? The reality is, these people ate these things. They were looking at the legs. They knew them. The difference was 2 legs, I believe, that were used for jumping just weren't counted as legs.
They were called something slightly different, like, I'd have to go look at that again, but they were obviously recognized as a different sort of leg, not the same kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, but isn't there still some racism that we can talk about for being in the Bible? We have things like, for instance, that descendants of people are, say, like the Moabites and the Ammonites, they're not allowed to enter into the temple of the Lord, and you're not allowed to marry people of the surrounding culture. I mean, that's being against interracial marriage, isn't it?
No, this is what that has to do with is that in their culture, your nationality was associated with your religion. So what you're seeing there is not racism; it's if you want to call it this, a religious prejudice. The assumption is that if you're a member of this nation, you are going to be a follower of the God of that nation. Now, there were, of course, some known exceptions. General rule, the assumption is that if you were following the God of Moab, or living in Moab, and vice versa. Now, we know of exceptions. We have Ruth. There are people who could convert. But they're not going to lay out exceptions. Granted, but it had nothing to do with a person's race or with their nationality per se. It had to do
Okay, sorry, it's just my connection's pretty bad today, so some of your ending and I'm not hearing you ending. So we can't really say there's anything like the modern equivalent of racism in the Bible, can we? It's foreign to our thinking, wasn't it?
No, we cannot. And there was a classical scholar named Frank Snowden who wrote an excellent book on this, in which he pointed out that racism as we know it certainly did not exist in that time. And the book was, I believe the title was The Invention of Color Prejudice. Yeah, Before Color Prejudice. There it is, yes. And that's an excellent book, by the way, even though it's not directly related to biblical studies. It's very good for helping to understand the social world of the Bible.
So, and when we look at the objections that have been brought forward by people like Arizona atheists, it's really just a way to still try and just pin the problem on Christianity and avoid any mention of positive Christianity. Like Christianity kind of has to be the cause of all the evils out there in the world today.
Yeah, clearly, the goal of someone like this, and we've singled him out, but there's so many others that I've encountered on YouTube who make similar comments. They're not interested in actually defining Christianity, or they just want to fit Hitler into it. Not like they're looking for criteria for who is a Christian.
And these are the same groups at the same time that if they come up and debate either you or I, they'll be very quick to tell us all this nonsense that we already believe, since everyone knows all Christians believe this anyway.
Oh, yeah. And as you and I well know, many of these people come from fundamentalist Christian backgrounds, so their assumption is that as fundamentalist Christians, many of them would probably have described you and I as heretics for many of the things we believe. It's a bit ironic.
Well, we've talked a little bit about racism. We're coming up on our next break, but let's get into a little bit about this. You've said there isn't racism in the Bible, but we really need to get on the idea of anti-Semitism in the Bible. I mean, for instance, in 1 Thessalonians 2, you have a passage where Paul talks about the struggles he's had against the Jews and how he says, the wrath of God has come upon them at last. Now, isn't that an anti-Semitic passage?
Yeah. Well, no, it's not at all. And, we definitely need to discuss that and a couple of other anti-Semitic passages and see how they were. And, of course, you have the same problem you sort of have with the idea of a de-Judaized Jesus, which is how in the world is Paul being anti-Semitic when he himself is a Jew? That's a little hard. You have to explain why he becomes anti-Semitic as a member of the very race he's supposed to be against in that. And you have the entire nearly all of the New Testament, except the works by Luke, was written by Jews. So how in the world are you going to find anti-Semitism in there? So now, did you say you need to take a break? Want to come back with that?
And now we're getting ready to, but let's give it a little bit of a start here. First off, let's answer one question about it. Some people think 1 Thessalonians 2, that passage, is an interpolation. Do we have any evidence that this is the case?
There is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that was interpolated. It's found in all the manuscripts. There are no questions about it being there, and that is for a somewhat different reason, of course. The people who say that are not interested in anti-Semitism. The one people we're talking about are mainly interested in saying that they're trying to get rid of the reference to the killing of Jesus as a historical figure, because that's one of Paul's most clear references to the historical crucifixion. And so those who believe that Jesus didn't exist are rather anxious to get rid of that passage. But there isn't the slightest evidence that it was ever missing from Paul's letter.
Okay, well, we're going to take a quick break right now. We'll discuss that a little bit more when we get back. And I guess it's J.P. Holding of Tectonics talking about his book, Hitler's Christianity. We'll be back after this break.
Hey, this is Minister Grok. Thanks for listening. Although Grok Radio is free, there are costs to upkeep the website, podcasts, and purchase Bibles and materials for street ministry. And while we are happy to pay this ourselves out of pocket, we will gladly accept any gift if you feel led to support the shows and our street ministry. You could send a gift or love offering through our website at cyiworldwide.com. Thanks for your support, and God bless.
And I'd like to remind everyone that, yes, what we do here is listener-supported. In fact, what my ministry partner does is supported by his supporters as well. Pretty much most of what we do, we do it out of our own free time, our own expenses and such. It's really hard work, and we need your support. So please support Blog Talk Radio and support what I'm doing here directly, please, at Deeper Waters. You can find out more on my blog at deeperwaters.wordpress.com, and you can support me through the Ratio Christi Issues and Answers team. And in fact, you can support me through JP's own ministry of Tectonics. JP, could you tell a little bit about how to do that and how they can support your own ministry as well?
When you go to my website, and I'll pull that up so I can be exact on this because I've redesigned the front page lately, you'll see that there's a black line across the top, and it refers to Welcome Hub, e-zine, videos, and support. And if you click that area, you'll see some instructions, you'll see some links to PayPal, and also some notes about how they can donate to support what you do particularly. I just tell people, if you want to support what Nick Peters is doing, just do your PayPal donation and leave me a note somehow, either by email or by some kind of memo through PayPal.
Mm-hmm. Like regular.
I lost you a bit on that.
Right? Yeah. If someone wants to support what you're doing, they just go through their regular, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and that same page is for supporting Tecton directly as well.
Okay, and Tecton is 501c3, and ministries made to me through Tecton are also 501c3, so all of it is tax deductible.
That is correct.
Now, when we talked about this passage in 1 Thessalonians 2, and said it's done by those who are Christ-miffers, normally, although, to be fair, I don't think everyone who thinks it's an interpolation is a Christ-miffer, but and I know Richard Carrier has made that argument. And heck, when I went to the library and started looking for commentaries, most of them didn't even bring up the idea of an interpolation at all, as if this isn't one that's taken seriously.
No, the vast majority do believe that it is authentic. I mean, I did my own count of commentaries in my local seminary library. I found at least 20 or 25 who were in favor of the passage being authentic, and there were maybe 6 or 7 that were against it.
And we should explain for listeners who don't know, an interpolation is that when you have the text and there is a part that's believed to be added into the text that's not part of what the original author wrote.
That's right. They think someone tampered with Paul's letters and added that in after he wrote it. But again, there's absolutely... Yeah.
Okay, there's no evidence.
No evidence to that, yeah, absolutely none.
But isn't it still anti-Semitic? I mean, it's saying, the wrath has come upon the Jews at last. As they say, they're getting what they deserve.
Well, there's a couple of things that need to be said about that. And the first thing is that Paul is calling on a tradition that is found in the Old Testament of condemnation. And his language mirrors some of the condemnations we find in the Old Testament that were issued by Jewish prophets against the Jewish people. The second thing is that Paul is in sort of walking a tightrope with the Thessalonians because they are his children, essentially, his spiritual children, and they are probably suffering a lot of persecution at the hands of Jews in their area who look upon them as members of a deviant cult and probably a false version of Judaism. And so and Paul had been persecuted by Jews in that area as well. And so there was sort of a tension there where he felt the need to somewhat support his spiritual children and also speak out against those who had attacked him. And we find that Paul does that frequently in other places in his letters. He resorts to extreme language like that. And culturally, there's something else we need to keep in mind too. We look at this and think that this must be hateful language. But we think that we can think of, to use an example, we see like African Americans addressing each other with the N-word, and you say, well, isn't that racist? And the answer obviously is no, it is not, because this is a different cultural supposition between the two parties. It's one thing for a member of a different race to use such derogatory language, but if it's an in-house kind of thing, the meaning is entirely different. And I use that analogy in addressing Arizona atheists with that kind of language with Paul. That's much closer to what was going on.
Yeah, we can have today that if you have a circle of friends, and myself being someone who's incredibly sarcastic, I was going on that I will tease my friends relentlessly, and it's understood in the context of the in-group. But if someone comes from the outside and is saying similar things, and I can tell it's not teasing, well, that's a call to arms right there. We're going to battle.
Right. There's always a context you have to look at. And people who say this about First Thessalonians are coming into this conversation between Paul and the Thessalonians, not knowing what's going on, and saying, you guys need to clean up your language.
Now, how about the Book of John also? Because the Book of John regularly has listed as enemies of Jesus, the Jews. Now, isn't that anti-Semitic?
Okay. Well, that's one of the greatest misunderstandings that we have. This idea, because first of all, people are reading into John's language like a contemptuous reference to the Jews, as though he were himself a Nazi. He was saying, "Oh, those Jews," as though he were addressing them in a contemptuous way. But more importantly, we assume that the word Jews means exactly the same thing as it does at this time. But again, John was a Jew, so he was a believer in the Jewish religion, so how could he be against other Jews? The answer to this is that the word used in the New Testament is actually more precisely Judeans, which it refers to people who were from the political area known as Judea, the Roman province of Judea. Now, when John uses the word the Jews, then, he's using it in contrast to people from where he was from, Galilee, as well as people from Samaria. Now, those people also considered themselves to be religiously Jews. But what John is doing then is he's illustrating a rivalry of geography, not a religious rivalry.
I'm not sure if you got to read it yet, but N.T. Wright has his translation of the New Testament out, the Kingdom New Testament, and I finished the Gospel of John in it this morning, and he translates the word as Judeans, which makes it so much easier.
I did not read that translation by him, but I did read in one of his earlier books, and this is actually where I got it, where I first got the idea, although I confirmed it in other sources. I read in one of his earlier books where he explained that Judeans is the proper translation.
Yeah, we can also look at the Gospel of Matthew. We find this saying in there that when it talks about them handing over Jesus to be crucified, it says, "His blood be on us and our children." You know, this has been one of the saddest cases in the history between Jews and Christians, because this verse has been horribly misused.
Yes, Matthew 27:25, and that one's sort of an ironic one too, because of the way it's been misinterpreted. And the key to the whole thing is that this is essentially said in parallel to Pilate washing his hands of the whole affair. We remember that Pilate was washing his hands because he wanted to say, "Hey, I'm not guilty of any of this. I'm innocent." Well, this profession, "His blood be on us and our children," was essentially the same thing as washing your hands. It was sort of like a dare. Rather than accept that they were responsible for Jesus dying, the crowd was saying, "We're not responsible for it either. It's not our fault." Pilate is saying it's not his fault, and so is the crowd. And so you could view it as sort of an ironic challenge back to Pilate. Like, yeah, let his blood be on us. Sure, right. That's the sort of attitude that should be into it.
Yeah. Now, although sadly, again, as we talk about the mistakes of the church in history, there has been anti-Semitism in the church at times, and this verse has been one of the verses that they have used to do that.
Yeah, it certainly has been. You can find that repeated throughout church history. And I did not address church history. I think you were one of the people who said you should have taken on Luther, all his interpretations as well. And that I looked into that briefly. It was just too much to get into at one time. Maybe I'll look at a later date. But either way, we can certainly agree, based on the evidence, that this was a misinterpretation of that verse and a misrepresentation of Matthew's intentions.
In fact, I think you and I could even say, as Orthodox preterists, that if any group of Jews was responsible and held responsible for the death of Jesus, that group is already dead. They've been judged, and there's no basis for bringing that condemnation on all Jews for our time.
Absolutely not. And even then, even in the people in that time, what you're talking about is a very small group of people who were clustered in, around Pilate, and that group of people was very likely made up of persons who were in the pay of the high priest, because the high priest had available to them thousands of these, you could call them gophers, people who worked for the temple and were at the beck and call of the high priesthood. And so most likely he sent all his own people over there to say what he wanted them to say. And so they definitely do not have the whole Jewish nation represented there. What you have is a very tiny group of the Jewish representing their own interests. And with those people who were gathered there on behest of the high priest would have thought of Jesus and the majority of their fellow Jews as basically unworthy of their attention. Just a bunch of peasants.
In fact, we see this in the Gospel of John in the 7th chapter when they were sent to arrest Jesus and say, like, this illiterate crowd, this uneducated crowd, they don't know the law like we do. We know the law, and we know this guy is not the Messiah.
Exactly. There was a strong dichotomy they held between themselves and the average people. And they certainly did not consider the average people to be smart enough to recognize who the real Messiah was.
Well, let's look at some other objections given to the claim that Hitler wasn't a Christian. And these come from your chapter on miscellaneous objections. That one of them, the German military wore belt buckles that read Gott mit uns. No, I'm sure I probably butchered that, but I wear it, which means God with us, and also use Christian symbols like the cross.
Okay. Well, there's a couple of things that need to be said about that. The first about so I think you said it pretty close to right. I took a little German back in community college. Yeah, I think you were pretty close there. The belt buckle motto was in use well before the time of the Nazis. It was the motto of the German army back in World War I, and so they carried it over. But even beyond that, they're, of course, going to reinterpret that saying as well as all the symbols like the cross in terms of positive Christianity. Of course, they still believed God was with them, but their God was a God who was in charge of positive Christianity, not the God of Orthodox Christianity.
And we have to remember that this is politics as well, and a political movement could say anything it wants to just to give a certain viewpoint. Our country might take things very differently. For instance, if Obama stood up one day and said, I'm not a Christian, I never have been, and I oppose Christianity. If he'd said that before the 2012 election, that could have been political suicide in some ways.
Yeah, in some ways. And you definitely also did not have any sort of emphasis on separation of church and state in the Nazi German era. They were, in contrast, the church and state were very much interacting with each other in ways that would probably make the ACLU spin around on its head. They would make them pretty angry. But with them, God was tied into their national identity as far as they were concerned, because, of course, as I mentioned earlier, they thought they had been chosen by God to deliver punishment on the unjust nations.
Of course, also, that means if Hitler up and speaks favorably about God or Christianity, for all we know, we have to check the context. He could be putting on a front. He could be trying to win over the church. He could be talking about positive Christianity. That it's incredible to me that these people who are saying this to say, well, we should just take a politician at his word immediately.
Well, I think the best option on that is he was talking about positive Christianity. And I don't doubt as well that he may have taken advantage of the fact that many people wouldn't have understood that that's where he was. That's what he believed in. Very likely, he let them assume that when he spoke of Jesus, he means the same Jesus we know of, not the Jesus of positive Christianity. Now, that's not to say there were not some among the German population who would not have understood him in positive Christian terms. There was a deviant cult among the people that followed positive Christian beliefs, and that was called the German Christians. And their church, just to give you an example, in addition to the cross up at the altar, they would have the swastika, and they would sing hymn Hitler. So they were like the popular expression of positive Christianity among the German people. But for the bulk of Germans otherwise, mostly the Catholics and the other Protestant denominations, they would probably have taken advantage of the sort of vagueness when Hitler spoke of Jesus and of God, and would have been glad to let them assume that he meant the same Jesus and God that they believed in.
And this is yet part of the reason why we need to have our intellectual faculties and critical skills developed. Because while we don't exactly encounter a Hitler here every day, if people are listening to preachers, politicians, anyone else out there, and they don't know how to discern the information for themselves, they're just at the mercy of whatever they hear.
That's right. That's right. That's why you and I are here.
Yep. Now let's get to the next objection. This is a very amusing one. This one should surely confirm to everyone that Hitler was a Christian. After all, he was baptized as a child and sang in the church choir.
Oh, that one is so good. I actually caught one atheist on YouTube on that, and he had to admit that I had a point. So many of these atheists I deal with, and that you deal with, are, of course, former Christians themselves. And they were baptized as children. Many of them sang in church choirs or performed some other function at church. I said, so I'd ask this fellow, are you a Christian? Well, of course, he had to say, well, of course, you know, they have to, at that point he had to admit that, yes, you know, I'm not a Christian anymore, I'm an atheist. And so Hitler being baptized and singing in a church choir simply doesn't mean that much.
And in fact, we could say that some people do go even further. I mean, Bart Ehrman went pretty far in a Christian education, and there was someone else I can think of, but considering his ego, he would love for me to mention who he is on the air here.
I see a black hat. There's a black hat somewhere over here.
Yeah, I think I won't mention it, but neither one of us would say this guy or Bart Ehrman today are Christians. In fact, Bart Ehrman would clearly come out definitely and say, I'm not a Christian, and same for this other guy.
Absolutely, you know. But yet, if you're going to use that as a criteria, they clearly still are. So there you go. There's your suggestion that you know, even atheists can be a Christian. There you go, because he was baptized as a child.
Okay. Hitler attended church and celebrated holidays like Christmas. He also alluded to the Bible and to providence in his speeches and writings.
Yeah, and once again, you know, we have the same thing. He would reinterpret everything in terms of positive Christianity, and we also have so many members of pseudo-Christian cults, you know, like the Mormons, and they do the same thing. We can't just say, well, he alluded to the Bible. More importantly, what did he think of the Bible, and what did he do about it? You know, Skeptics Annotated Bible alludes to the Bible all the time.
Yeah. And today we have several atheists who will still take part in Christmas festivities, and I know a number of them who are married to Christians, and in order to respect their spouse, they'll attend church with their spouse, even though they don't believe any of it.
Exactly. So that does not mean a thing at all. No.
Okay. In 1923, one of Hitler's associates said Hitler was still today a convinced Catholic. And Hitler said to one of his generals in 1941, I am now as before a Catholic and will always remain so.
Okay. Well, that one's, you know, that's a combination of some things we've talked about earlier. You know, first of all, you have to interpret that within what he believed about positive Christianity. He obviously thought that he was representing true Christianity, and he most likely thought he was also representing true Catholicism. He would have seen the other clearly he would have seen the other Catholics as having deviant beliefs. And of course, as we know, many members of, you know, cults like the Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses profess still to be Christians, to be convinced Christians. And so that's, you know, a simple statement like that is not something you just take at face value. It seems so ironic that many critics take face value statements like that and take them over evidence, and we're supposed to interpret all the evidence in terms of this simple statement, rather than the other way around.
Well, we're going to take a quick break right now, our final break. We'll be back to wrap this up. Since you mentioned the Catholic Church, we're going to get into an objection involving the Catholic Church when we get back. I'm Nick Peters, Deeper Waters Podcast. My guest is J.P. Holding, and we'll be back after this break.
Oh, yeah. Hey, folks, it's Will ZPI, and you guys got to check out CYIWorldwide.com, home of The Grok Show, free MP3s, music, advice, and even prayer support. That again is CYIworldwide.com. Check it out.
I'm Nick Peters of the Deeper Waters Podcast. My guest is J.P. Holding. For our final segment, we're talking about his book, Hitler's Christianity. If you want to call in, the number is 714-242-5180. Now, this next objection, J.P., you've got that you say that it is true, and a lot of people make a big deal about this one. You probably know where I'm going already. Hitler was never excommunicated from the Catholic Church.
Okay, yeah. Well, yeah, I never found no one seems to know exactly why he was never excommunicated. I found several opinions on this idea. One historian said it may have been because it would have endangered the safety of Catholics in Germany, which I think was a pretty serious consideration for, although it seems like it's something important to do, or is it worthwhile to excommunicate Hitler if you're going to end up killing tens of thousands of people because of it? At the time, the Catholic Church is often hesitant to excommunicate people. I mean, many people who are atheists today who used to be Catholic have themselves not been excommunicated, and it's something maybe you have to ask to be done for you. And I'm not going to obviously speak on behalf of the Catholic Church any further than that.
Right.
But it does seem like they seem to believe that we shouldn't excommunicate people unless they except under very stringent circumstances. There's always a chance that they could return to the fold. I personally think, though, that the idea that it would have been dangerous to Catholics in Germany to do that is the most likely explanation. Well, of course, they're not going to say that out loud because that ruins the effect. And I do have a note too, as well, that Albert Speer had said that Hitler said that he remained a member of the Catholic Church even though he had no real attachment to it. And you compare that with the notion that he also ordered Goering and Goebbels to remain members for the sake of appearance. So to that extent, you could say his Catholicism did have a political purpose. From both sides, the Catholic Church might not have wanted to excommunicate him because of the very serious impact that might have had on Catholics in Germany. At the same time, his own attachment to it was highly questionable.
Well, here's the next one. Hitler shook hands with a pope or some other Catholic official, so he must have been a Christian.
Yeah, there's a picture that's put around of Hitler shaking hands with a cardinal, and sometimes that's wrongly identified as the Pope, but it's really a cardinal from Germany, apparently. And I have that picture on the front of my website right now as a motion for this interview. And just because Hitler shakes hands with the popes, that doesn't make him, or with some Catholic official, that doesn't make him a Christian. And you can find a picture of the last pope shaking hands with the Dalai Lama. Obviously, the Dalai Lama did not deconvert from Buddhism to Catholicism, and John Paul II didn't deconvert to Buddhism. But shaking hands doesn't tell you a whole lot.
Well, why don't we take a brief look also, in fact, what was the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Nazis? I mean, did the Church support them? Did they condemn them? Or were they neutral? What was the relationship?
It was a very difficult relationship, and it was spurred by events from as far back as the 19th century when Catholicism was sort of subjected to a sort of formal persecution. Nothing as quite as serious as people being killed, but they were pressed as a somewhat deviant, not allow the same kind of act that they might have been otherwise. And in light, the Catholic Church was probably looking out for the safety of its own people. In addition to some of the factors that we mentioned earlier about Romans 13, the Catholic Church, at the national level, sought to make an agreement with Hitler that the Catholic Church was allowed to basically run its own business and not have any interference with the government. Fortunately, Nazis pegged on that agreement pretty quickly. They were busy about suppressing the Catholic Church, along with some of the Protestant people in particular. But they would suppress the Catholic Church, and they would make things hard on them. For example, by saying that you can have your youth meetings, but we're going to schedule the Nazi youth meetings at the same time, and those are mandatory. is not really a choice.
No.
It's like if you have to show up at the Nazi youth meeting, it's mandatory. You obviously cannot attend church, although many of them still did. They ignored the demand, and I do understand that Cardinal Ratzinger, the last pope, was one of the young people who resisted call to the Nazi youth.
Nice.
I found interesting.
Well, let's talk about the other churches. One thing you got in here is that the objection bar is that the churches never accused Hitler of apostasy.
Okay, well, that's not entirely true, because the Catholic Church did call positive Christianity a heresy. Although they didn't necessarily name Hitler, they did recognize his beliefs. On the Protestant side, several people identified positive Christianity as a heresy, and among those was Karl Barth, who was probably, you can call him the most conservative theologian in Nazi Germany at the time. And he was not from Nazi Germany. He was from Switzerland, and he refused to do the Hitler salute as a teacher in one of their universities. Ended up getting thrown out of Nazi Germany because of it. But he was quite strong about saying this is a heresy, and it's wrong. So in practice, Hitler was accused of apostasy and identified as an apostate.
Okay, let's look at this next one then. If Hitler had really wished to eliminate Christianity, why did he try to unite the Protestant and Catholic churches in Germany?
Well, we first need to understand that we're not arguing that Hitler tried to eliminate Christianity, which is something that is falsely posed as the position that we're trying to take. What he was really trying to do was to keep the churches intact so that they could serve his purposes. The church, as weak as it was, it still served the purpose of unifying and providing morale for the German people. And in the mind of someone like Hitler, a population with good morale was much more effective as a fighting force than one that didn't have morale. And this leads to a point that we do see from their actions and from their plans that had the Nazis won the Second World War, they had planned to take care of the church and put it next on their list of things to take care of. I mean, and Goebbels in particular said, let them do what they want. They're going to pay the bills when all this is over with.
Mm-hmm. And we also have to keep in mind that had Hitler come out and said, for instance, my plan is to eliminate the churches in Germany, he wouldn't have had the following that he had.
Absolutely not. He could not just get rid of them, 1, 2, 3, and that's in good part because, of course, it was easy to persecute the Jews as a minority. He couldn't do the same people who professed alignment with the church because that was nearly the entire German population.
Mm-hmm. And we here today in America would be able to learn from this that just as the church couldn't be eliminated by Hitler today, but back then, since they weren't a minority, we're not a minority here, and maybe the church in America could, actually do something.
Church in America actually do something like today you're talking about?
Yep.
Yeah, well, we definitely could, and you and I have both been, quite on top of the church as a whole for not taking action on things. They were in a unique situation, aside from being a weakened church, of course. Although you didn't have a Gestapo member standing on every corner, they would send Gestapo to church, take notes, track what was. Their view too was that you could just kill the snake by cutting off the head, and they would not persecute the rank and file, but they would persecute the pastors or make life hard on them. You had probably the best example of that kind of thing was when Hitler Youth came over to break into the house of a pastor, and they didn't hurt him, but they did assault him and wreck some of his stuff. Made it clear, hey, there's going to be more to come if you don't wise up. And that's the sort of thing that they would engage in. That's as far as they could probably go without engaging the wrath of the everyday churchgoer.
Okay. Well, let's look at the next objection. Cardinal Faulhaber of Munich visited Hitler at his mountain retreat in Obersalzberg and confessed, without a doubt, the Chancellor lives in faith in God. He recognizes Christianity as the foundation of Western culture.
Well, again, this doesn't erase all the fact that Hitler professed some heretical beliefs. We know he did. But again, too, someone like that cardinal is someone who would just be deceived by Hitler into thinking that he was what he was not. And if we need more examples, we know that Neville Chamberlain said that Hitler was a person that the British could work with. Clearly, that was not the case.
Okay. Well, let's talk very briefly then before we wrap things up about research methodologies and such. What tips would you give someone who's going to research this even further?
There's a number of books you can start with, and I list them in a bibliography, or I list them in the notes for Hitler's Christianity. A good place to start is Richard Stephen Gall's Holy Reich. This was the book that got me started looking further into the issue. And although I don't think Stephen Gall was theologically savvy enough to divide off positive Christianity from mainstream Christianity, he at least gives you a lot of good information about what Nazi leaders believed and what Hitler believed. And then there were a couple of other books that I found particularly helpful. Let me find the titles in here. There was a couple one by Susanna Heschel called Aryan Jesus, and that was a particularly good book because it's the one that talked about their apologetics organization. She discussed the Institute. The exact title is The Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians, and the Bible in Nazi Germany. That was last one I recommend here. Let me go ahead and find that one in my listing. Is Doris Bergen's Twisted Cross, the German Christian Movement in the Third Reich. And that book went into detail about the movement I mentioned, the deviant movement among the people which supported positive Christian beliefs, the German Christian. In those two books, you'll know a lot more than the average Arizona atheist out there claiming that Hitler was a Christian.
What tips, though, would you give, in fact, for researching this kind of thing, and in fact, researching most any kind of topic?
Okay, so more in general as well. Well, the key to much of this is, first of all, find people who are accredited scholars in the field of whatever it is you're trying to study. Too many times, people think you just go to Wikipedia and pick the first thing off of there, and we're all done. And, you know what I feel about Wikipedia. I call it the abomination that causes misinformation. Although sometimes people on there may use credible sources, they very seldom do, I find, or they don't know how to use them. Much better to just go to a local library, go on Amazon.com, and find a book that is by someone who knows what they're talking about.
Right.
Then the key as well is to find as many of these books as you can if you're going to do a thorough job. And you might have to end up going to your local library, your college library nearby. You might have to sit in the library for a while reading. It's not easy work. It's not something where you just pull a rabbit out of a hat. You have to do some legwork, and I would say that's one of the best pieces of advice of all for doing research is be prepared to do work. Be prepared to read a lot of sources. Yes.
And of course, you have to go to the primary sources as much as possible. Right? If you're studying, for instance, the New Testament, you go to the New Testament, the Old Testament, then you go to Jewish literature of a time, and you might want to check the early church fathers, and you might want to check Greek writings of a time, and especially with...
Exactly. Yes.
Yep.
Yes, and in this case, too, you would want, for the study I did on this, you would want to read the biographies of the leaders and any of their own writings that you can get hold of, though frequently, the biographies will have a lot of their own writings, too.
And, of course, in the research, it's always important to check the other person's claims. As you and I both know, a lot of claims get made about what people say on the internet that aren't very true. I'm thinking right off about the quote that some people used to say that Albert Schweitzer even argued that Jesus never even existed. And anyone who read Albert Schweitzer,
Absolutely, yeah. That was a bogus quote that you suggested, where Schweitzer supposedly said this Jesus did not exist, and you find that he's really talking about a specific view of Jesus and not the human Jesus who walked the earth. And what's amusing about that is Schweitzer even wrote a book later on in which he had some nasty things to say about people who believe that Jesus didn't exist.
Well, we've got about 5 minutes left on our show. JP, if anyone's really curious about what you've said today and they want to find out more about you and your work, how do they get in touch with you? Where do they go?
Okay, well, the website, again, is techtonics.org, tektonics.org. If you want to know about this specific topic, Hitler's Christianity is available through a link on the front page. It is a Kindle ebook, so you don't have to walk down to Alden bookstore or whatever. All you have to do is buttons on Amazon.com, and there it is. And the site itself, again, I have like over 1,500 articles right now and 370 videos on the channel, YouTube channel. You could spend a lot of time there. I know a lot of people have.
And the YouTube channel is Tekton TV, right?
That's right, Tekton TV. And in fact, if you go to the bottom of my front page, you'll see we just released an excellent new video. Have you watched it yet?
Oh, yeah. As soon as you send them to me, I watch them. And for those who don't know, yes, I do run JP's Facebook page for him.
Yes, he does. Yes, he does. Well, we just released a real funny video about supposed connections between Jesus and the Egyptian god Horus. And we have an excellent bit of voice work being done on there by a fellow named Paul Whetstone. And I'm not going to spoil the effect for anyone. I'm going to let them find out for themselves what it's about. But let's just say that the Egyptian god Horus is depicted in a somewhat interesting way.
Yes, I found it very amusing. And I see also on the page that you're writing an ebook on conspiracy theories. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm working on two at the same time. I'm writing one on conspiracy theories, which is like some of these ideas that the about Babylonian mystery religion, about Alexander Hislop. I'm also looking into things like these claims that the Freemasons or the Illuminati somehow are adjusting, world events. And as part of that as well, I'm going to release a little earlier a section of it on allegations that parts of Christmas celebrations are inspired by paganism. For example, this idea that Jeremiah 10 condemns Christmas trees. And that's a kind of fascinating trick, because Jeremiah is condemning something that wouldn't exist until like 2,000 years later. But I'm hoping to have that one finished by December 1st, and that'll be just a short one. So that, because we've had some people, you and I have met both of them, who are worried about celebrating Christmas in good conscience. And we know of many of these people who think that it's evil to celebrate Christmas, and that's what that's going to be addressed to.
Well, maybe when these ebooks come out, we can have you come back on the show again to talk about, and we're booked for Christmas, maybe with conspiracy theories. We can have you come back on and talk about that sometime.
I'll be glad to.
Okay, well, we've got a little over 2 minutes left. What's a final message you would like to leave for my listening audience?
Okay, well, first of all, I want to issue some compliments to you, and so you can sort of in on this, okay? For those who don't know, I've known Nick for a long time, and he wrote to me, what was it, 2003 or so? I forget how long ago it was. And I featured some of his writings as a guest poster. And see, I've always believed in doing that because, I was given a chance to, show my stuff a long ago by someone else in a higher position. And so I'm always glad to do that for people as well. And, you've seen what's happened since then. I mean, who would have known back in 2003 that you would be doing a podcast like this right now and that you'd be married to Mike Lacona's daughter? I mean, who would believe that, right? Who would believe that back then? Yep. Nope. So, I just want to say, in closing, I'm glad to have been able to give you the chance to be where you are now. And I think you've been a great success in that regard.
We've got someone who's just called in. We got a little bit less than 60 seconds, but I think I know who this guy is. So right quick, caller, you're on the air. Make it quick.
JP, Nick, I have wonderful news. I found one of the guys in Charlotte who asked you to review Zeitgeist.
Did you?
His name is...
Okay, yeah, that's a running joke we've had. That's a little running joke we've had going on here.
I'll have the pretzel tied up. I'll have that pretzel tied up pretty soon.
Okay, well, we're getting ready to sign off with JP. I thank you for coming on. I hope you've enjoyed your time here.
Indeed. Thank you very much, man. We'll talk to you later.
And remember, next week, everyone, we have Paul Meyer on here. So be sure to listen to that. I'm Nick Peters, signing off for Deeper Waters Podcast.